I'm glad to be here and talk to you about what's new in Cognos 10.2.1 for BI. And I'm also going to sprinkle in from time to time the new capabilities that were part of the fix pack that was released, as Jesse said, on the 10. And technically now the current release version is 10.2.1.1. So you'll see on the slide it'll actually say 10.2.1.1 on those things that are specifically new with the fix pack. And of course, the fix pack also included, as usual, a collection of bug fixes and so on. Today we're going to talk just in general, what's 10.2.1 all about, what were the major themes. We'll talk about some details on the performance improvements that were baked into this release, because that is one of the big things. We'll talk a little bit about big data. We'll talk then in some detail about the new features and functionality available in the areas of administration and architecture, framework manager, the report authoring tools, some mobile info, updates relative to the use of dynamic cubes, which were introduced in an earlier 10 release, and updates relative to a multi-tenant implementation and a control panel for managing your tenants. So with that as preamble, let's jump in and just talk in general. 10.2.1 has a few things that are worth noting. First of all, when you upgrade and you launch it, there is an overall look and feel upgrade. It's not so vast that you're going to confuse anybody. The Cognos connection is still called the Cognos connection, but a lot of the icons have changed, some in a big way, some in a small way. The color schemes that are default color schemes have changed. Some fonts have changed. So it will be obvious that you've upgraded to 10.2.1 when you do. Unlike the earlier releases, really the look and feel changes were virtually none. In this case, there's actually a look and feel change. You can see the welcome screen there. That's the 10.2.1 new welcome screen, different color scheme, different layout slightly. So you will notice something. When you go to 10.2.1, if you're also a TM1 user, your current version of TM1, which would be, it doesn't have to be the new 10 version. It can be the version before it. That's also considered current. Both of those will work with the 10.2.1 upgrades. So you're not going to orphan your TM1. You're not going to run into problems if you upgrade. Pricing and licensing remain the same, as Jesse said. And there were three major focuses in the 10.2.1 release where there were some improvements that we could categorize. The first one is in something called an interactive visualization. You'll hear terms like RAVE, Rapidly Adaptable Visualization Engine, I believe that stands for. You'll hear things about the analytics zone and about many eyes. What this is really is a new chart engine for Cognos BI. And it is an animated interactive chart engine that really expands by light years, some might say, the charting capabilities that are baked into the Cognos BI product. And I will give you an example of an active report built using visualizations to give you a flavor for what I mean by light years advanced. Performance, big deal here. Performance improvements were enough that just upgrading one of my VMs on which we do development work here at LPA and making no other changes, the performance change was dramatic and noticeable. Cognos has made very big investments in this release in the memory utilization world and the use of compression world, and the number of threads that are spawned and minimizing those and so on. I'll go into some details about the kind of performance improvements that can be seen with this release in a slide or two, but that was a big theme of this. And then finally, the other big theme in this release was increased support for the use of big data as a data source in Cognos BI. So those are the themes. Let's kind of deep dive into some of the details behind those themes. And again, FixPack is available. You can download it from Fix Central, so you can install FixPack 1 and upgrade to 10.2.1.1. So from a performance improvements perspective, Activereports were introduced in an earlier version of 10, and they are a standalone BI environment, a resident in a file called an MHT file or a MIME hypertext file. They are BI for disconnected users. It includes interaction like responding to prompts, filtering, drilling, and so on. Those files are usually measured in megabytes. In this release, they are 3 times smaller. So if you will, you can fit a lot more in the same amount of space than you used to because of compression. Because of the compression, you're also able to use memory better because these are loaded into memory when you run them. So they're actually quite fast because they're loaded up into memory. So if you can use less memory and you can compress the data, right, you get a lot better performance out of them. And if they're smaller, they're easier to move around because they're sort of a BI in a box kind of thing. So you got to move them. You got to get them to the BI user. So smaller, faster, terrific gains in Activereports. And again, when I upgraded to 10.2.1 and reran the Activereports that I had written in the previous releases, no changes. I didn't even have to reopen and edit the report. I just ran the report and generated new MHT, and it was far smaller. On top of that, with the new visualizations, replacing potentially the charts that you had embedded in your Activereports, they will be even smaller still because the way that the RAVE visualizations are stored in the MHT file is far more optimized than the way that the if you will, older chart libraries are embedded. So it even makes Activereports smaller and more compressed and more optimal. Mobile's had a number of architecture changes in terms of how mobile requests to run reports are processed. By and large, they're pushing as much as they can onto your BI server for your connected mobile users rather than trying to do it all locally on, say, your iPad, which means you're going to get better throughput. And it also increases the ability for you to do things like audit what's being run and who's logging in to the mobile applications. So those are all very good things. And as a result of moving the load to the larger, more powerful tier, you're getting 3 times faster execution of your reports when you're running them in mobile. Dynamic cubes were introduced in 10.2.0. They are a memory resident using dynamic query mode cube based on your relational data. They have a lot of the good features of your dimensionally modeled relational data, your DMR quasi-cubes that are part of Framework Manager, and power cubes in TM1 in terms of OLAP capability, and they're aggregate aware. We have a webinar on dynamic cubes on our YouTube channel and also available for playback off of our website. So if you're curious about dynamic cubes, we have an hour deep dive into those. And I think these are going to become a very important part of a lot of BI organizations' strategy moving forward, especially when you're serving an analyst and business community with tools like Cognos Workspace Advanced. In this release, they really worked a lot on the optimal use of memory. Because these are memory resident cubes, that's a really important consideration. And they're roughly 2 times faster than they were in previous releases, in part because they've improved the query engine and reducing the number of queries being generated for cubes because with field experience, they've gotten smarter about how cube query generation should go. So big improvements as far as dynamic cube use. In addition, there were also some changes to the Cognos administration screens to help you administer your dynamic cubes once you've deployed them. I'll show you a screenshot of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Report bursting. It used to be, prior to this release, that report bursting had to be handled on one of your application servers. In other words, once I started bursting, it couldn't load balance the bursted report across multiple application servers. In this release, they have changed that. So you can enable load balancing of your reports that are being bursted across your report services, which lets you leverage their farm. If you're a multi-server install, this is a really important piece. If you're a smaller install, if you have a single server install, then this will not impact you, it will not hurt you, it won't help you, kind of thing. But if you have multiple server installs, if you have 2 or more dispatchers running the application tier, then and you do a lot of report bursting, this can actually improve the performance of your bursted reports up to 6x. Batch, this is unattended report running. Scheduled reports is the other way to think of this. The way that the batch report service runs has been optimized to result in a 25% improvement in unattended report execution. So if you've scheduled a lot of reports and you're running those to, let's say, email results to your user community, they will run faster without making any other changes but upgrading in this release. They focused a lot on the use of disk, because it turns out, as you get better and better in terms of how you use memory, which has a lot of benefits in terms of lower lag to doing work, then the next big bottleneck that comes up is going to be disk, because the disk is still a mechanical thing. So optimizing how disks is used was another big part of this release, and they're seeing an 85% reduction in the amount of disk activity, which has, as you will, commensurate increases in throughput and performance overall, because there's not the disk lag that there used to be in terms of what they were caching on disk in previous releases. In terms of the number of threads that are spawned as processing is done, it's not something that necessarily people are aware of or are monitoring explicitly. However, dispatcher threads come and go as report execution requests are processed. The startup and shutdown of a thread takes overhead. If you can reduce that overhead, you get better throughput, and that's exactly what they focused on in terms of platform overhead. So they've seen now a 45% reduction in the number of dispatcher threads created and torn down, which again results in better throughput for us. The other theme of big data, I just have one slide on it because the long and short of the story there is support now for more than just IBM Big Insights as a big data source for your BI reporting and analysis. So what Cognos did is they took a look at who the leaders are in terms of big data sources, which would be AWS, Cloudera, Hortonworks, and of course IBM is among the leaders. It's hard to tell on the picture here from Forrester whether or not they're the absolute leader or if AWS is tied. But at this point, the story here is that IBM has added support for these data sources. In addition, Amazon Web Services, which is not something that Forrester is tracking, so it's not on the Forrester chart. So these new, excuse me, I misspoke. It's Apache that's not on the Forrester chart, AWS is. So in addition to what Forrester calls the leaders in big data support for the most part, plus the Apache big data support, those are all part of the 10.2.1 stack now in terms of big data sources. So that's the big data part of 10.2.1. All right, now moving into sort of a deep dive into different subject areas across the BI spectrum. First of all, we'll talk about architecture and administration. When you install Cognos 10.2.1, unlike previous releases, the gateway that installs matches the install kit. So if you're a Windows user, you get to choose between installing a 32-bit kit or a 64-bit kit. In previous releases, it didn't matter which kit you install. The gateway defaulted to the 32-bit gateway. In 10.2.1 and forward, and this makes a big difference as you're setting up your IIS for us Windows folks. If you install the 64-bit install kit, you get a 64-bit gateway as your default. So that changes your application pool settings and that kind of stuff. So if you're an installer, right, knowing what the default gateway is important. So 32-bit install kit, 32-bit gateway default. 64-bit install kit, which is all of Unix and Linux, and sometimes Windows, 64-bit gateway is the default now with 10.2.1 and going forward. Dynamic cubes and multi-tenant capabilities now have their own administration screens. I'll actually show you those later when we talk about those topics specifically. You've always been able to store stored outputs, run a report on a scheduled basis, create a PDF each night or each month or each minute, I suppose, because you can schedule that into the minute. And those defaults to being stored in your content store database, you could set up that those should not be stored in that database, but should be stored centrally in IBM FileNet or on your file system. They have enhanced some support for that external storage. So there are some additional options here, some additional optimizations here when you are storing stored outputs outside of your content store database. So those are new. You can now set content archiving on objects in your My folders. So it used to be that when I said, let's archive previous versions of stored outputs outside my content store and put them here, whether that's in FileNet or whether that's on a file system, I couldn't set that setting in My folders. With this release and going forward, now I can archive. So if my users are doing a lot of scheduled runs out of their My folders and keeping multiple versions of stored outputs, you can set their My folders so that it will archive those outside the content store, because content store bloat means slow content store, slow Cognos. So the more you can archive outside and the leaner and meaner your content store database is, typically then the better. You can deploy My folders now in a more granular way. So it used to be when I wanted to import or export content from Cognos. My folders were sort of an all or nothing activity. I couldn't, import Rich Chester's my folder or export Rich Chester's my folders. Now we have more granular control over the importing and exporting of my folders, so that's baked into this release. Audit reports for mobile. This is partly enabled because of the way they changed what tier is running the mobile reports. But now that more of it's happening on the BI server tier, more can be audited. And the audit reports now are conscious of the fact that there's mobile in them. The audit database has been updated slightly, and you can now query the audit database for information about the usage patterns of your mobile users, which is nice. Burst options. I talked earlier about the fact that you can now load balance. You're bursting. The little screenshot here shows you that when you run and you say, I'm going to burst the report, and you turn that option on, now you have a couple of options there. You can actually indicate that you do or do not want to run across multiple application servers in parallel, and whether or not to use query prefetching, which is about when Cognos sees that you're using a certain percentage of the number of members in a dimension, it will actually go and get all the members, or all of the members of that dimension. So if you, let's say that you're actually referencing 70% of the members in this query, Cognos isn't going to cache just the 70%. It's going to say, yep, he's probably going to use them all. Let me go prefetch those. So you can turn that on and off as well. Lots of users will just leave them by default. But if you've got users, or if you're the administrator and you want to set that specifically, you have those options at the time you schedule the report to be bursted, because remember, bursting only happens as a scheduled, a background activity, so it's a batch kind of thing. Nothing new in Query Analysis or Event Studio. They've done some bug fixes in those tools, but there are no new functionality been released in those studios. They deprecated a couple of things. There was a product that you could purchase separately from BI called IBM Cognos Statistics. That product has been discontinued and is no longer supported moving forward. So if you are an owner of IBM Cognos Statistics, you cannot upgrade to this release because it is not compatible. Similarly, Cognos, as vendors retire products, as they stop supporting products, Cognos stops supporting them sometime after that. So SAP Enterprise Portal, those versions are not actively supported by SAP, and now Cognos no longer guarantees that they'll work in those portal environments as well. So those are the deprecated features as part of 10.2.1. It's very seldom that IBM updates Framework Manager in a release like this, but in this case, with 10.2.1, they did update Framework Manager in a couple of small ways. And one way is in the governors set in Framework Manager. So under the project menu, there's a collection of governors you can edit. And they added a bunch of DQM, dynamic query mode governors, to help you control, by and large, how the cache is used, how big the cache is, whether you're using the local cache or not. Some master detail caching that takes place to try to optimize relational master detail queries when you're using dynamic query mode for master detail type things. So there's a lot of emphasis, I believe, on using the dynamic query mode engine, the 64-bit query service that starts up by default when you run Cognos. And what they're finding is that we need more control, more explicit control of how that cache is used that comes along with DQM. And so these updates to Framework Manager give us that control at the model level, which lets us set them if you look globally for a package or a model. In addition, you've always been able to run stored procedure query subjects in Framework Manager. But by default, Cognos would run stored procedure query subjects in a read-only mode. And sometimes it's actually nice to be able to tell the database that we want to run those in read-write mode, because within that stored procedure query subject, you could actually be doing updates. It's not just about returning a cursor and returning rows. In that stored procedure, you might actually be doing an update in addition to returning rows. And so being able to have a transaction access mode explicitly of read-write is a good thing for that specific scenario of stored procedure query subjects that are doing update activities. So that's been added as a property that you can have on your data source connection. In Report Studio, there's a number of things. The ones that are starred are also changes to Cognos Workspace Advanced, which if you've been on previous webinars with me about CWA, you know that CWA is another skin on top of Report Studio. So that's why we're going to see that a lot of improvements to Report Studio will also flow through the CWA. Not all, but a lot of them. In this case, the ones with stars having been flowed through the CWA. For example, Microsoft Excel output has been enhanced in terms of those pesky grouped columns. Sometimes we want our Excel output to keep them grouped and merge those cells. Sometimes we wish that Cognos would degroup them, and now I have that option. So I'll see another slide on that to show you more about those features. The text-based filters on relational data, allowing me to do contains, begins with, ends with, or matches a SQL pattern. That's part of this release. So if I have a text filter, if I have people are typing in text items in a prompt, I can do more with that text item than just starts with, which is what I used to have. In Report Studio only, when I drag a new item into my report, a list, a crosstab, a chart, a map, Cognos now will prompt me explicitly to name the item that I'm dropping in, and this is because, of course, now all of my items in my reports are available to drag onto Cognos workspaces, and having them default to names like List 1 or Crosstab 1 or Chart 1 is not so useful. And I always forget, at least me, I forget to rename the darn things until I'm later in the development process. Now, when I drag in an item, it will actually prompt me to give it a name, and it'll also at that time let me rename the query, which is great, or reuse an existing query. So I'll show you a slide with that prompt in it so you can see more about that. That's a Report Studio only change. And then again, both in CWA and Report Studio, there's a couple of changes when I'm using an OLAP source, a dimensional source, for my report, presenting crosstab values as percentages, using an ends with option when I search for members in very deep or very long dimensions, and sharing sets between reports. And I have some slides on these things as well. In addition, in the Fix Pack, there is a new page tool in Report Studio only. And you can see it there on the bottom screen. In red there's a report reference page. So you used to be able to drag new pages over, create a multi-page report. You used to be able to do page sets to control page skipping when data items change and so on. Now I have this thing called a report reference that I can add. Report references let you reference existing reports and say, let me take the pages from report 1, the pages from report 2, the pages from report 3, and merge them into another report as though they're all the same report, and then manage this. So if I have like a book, like a management book that I report on each month, and right now I'm assembling pages from multiple Report Studio reports because they come, let's say, from multiple packages, into a book by hand, I could actually use this tool now to merge them in a single schedulable, runnable report and have it build that report book for me. So that's what this tool is for. So that's kind of a nice thing, and that's only when you apply the Fix Pack 1 to your 10.2.1 environment. Now that Excel 2007 grouping change. So in the report, on a report-by-report basis, mind you, this is in the report properties in Report Studio or in CWA, I can check a checkbox to group the repeating cells when exporting to Excel, which, by the way, is the default behavior, or uncheck that, right? And then it will ungroup. So on the left-hand side, I've got a group list running in HTML, and it's merging them, and it's the way I typically want my HTML to look. But when I export this to Excel 2007, I have the option to say, yeah, don't dedupe, don't merge the cells. And so you see on the right-hand side, that would be when I uncheck the group repeating cells when exporting to Excel option. So by default, it's on. I can turn it off on a report-by-report basis. And when my users say, run this to Excel 2007, it will come out the way the picture shows. It will redupe, I guess, the grouped items so that this report is now, let's say, more suitable to be a data tab for further analysis in Excel. So that's the change relative to Excel output. That text-based relational filter world. So this is relational data only. All right, we were always able to say, does it match a specific set of values? But now I've got this starts with, ends with, contains, and matches a SQL pattern capability. So now I can have my users enter things as sort of like search criteria in a text base. I don't have to use a search filter per se for text-based relational. And I can use this capability. You see that it's really baked into using this prompted filter builder world. When I've been able in Report Studio only, when I'm writing my filters from scratch by hand using the expression editor, I've always had options like this. What I'm talking about is the wizard-driven relational filters in CWA and Report Studio for text items now include these options. So that's a very specific use case for filtering. In Report Studio, if you're writing your filters from scratch using the expression editor, you'll realize this is not new. It's just now exposed through this wizard for entering filters, if you will. When I drag onto a report, a new list, a new crosstab, a new chart, a new map, or when I begin a brand new chart or map report, I am prompted to give that object, that chart, that list that I've added or that I'm creating in those new reports, a name. And again, these names are visible in Cognos Workspace, and we have to be very conscious now that Workspace is there and available to my enhanced consumers, that they're going to be opening these reports and trying to drag my objects onto Workspaces. And so naming them in a meaningful way is a very important step now as an author. So this prompting me immediately upon adding those objects to my page reminds me to name them, which is great. It will also let me change which query they're using right from here, and it'll let me rename the queries if I'm creating a new query, which is great. So when I create a brand new list or crosstab, I don't get this prompt. I still have to remember for brand new list and crosstab reports to go and name the object. When I create a new chart or map, it actually prompts me for the name right when I create the report. And regardless of what report template I use to start, anytime I add a new data container from the toolbox, it prompts me. So it's a great add and is going to be a very helpful thing, I think, for us to remember to keep my Workspace users in mind, and also to name my queries something other than query 1 through n to help me in terms of query reuse and debugging and modifying. If you're using a dimensional data source in CWA or Report Studio, you've got a couple of improvements here. The first improvement is over there under the data menu. You'll see there's a show data as menu item, and in there I get to change for a crosstab and a crosstab only. I get to say whether or not I want the actual values of the data item I put over there. So in my case here, I've got revenue in my intersections. I dropped revenue in, and by default, it's going to show me totaled up revenue, dollars. Now I can actually have it convert the dollars to a percent, and I can have it do a percent of the grand total, a percent of the row total, or a percent of the column total. So I've got all of those options underneath this menu. So that's new, and that's really bringing Report Studio and CWA into line with capabilities in Analysis Studio and PowerPoint from a presentation of values perspective. So it's they're sort of caught up now and effectively are on par now with this functionality, which is good, I guess. In dimensions that have large numbers of members, over 25 members, you get this search hyperlink at the bottom of the member list when you expand the level in your model. And you've been able to search on starts with and contains kinds of things. They've added this ends with to the search options. So searching for members, you still have to when you have large dimensions. Cognos by default only displays the first 25, I believe it is, and then gives you this search hyperlink. Now you have an ends with as opposed to just a starts with or a contains. So that's the new piece there. And then the last thing that is relative to just if you're using a OLAP source, this would be a cube type source, you can share sets between reports. So if I had a report, for example, where I defined a set of members from a dimension, let's say that this is my set of members that is the developing markets. So all of my regions that I consider the developing market regions, I might actually define those in a set in a report. I can add that report reference to the package that is representing my cube, and other people who use that package could now reference that developing markets set in their report and drag it on their report and put it on the crosstab or put it on the chart, and they can write all kinds of reports about developing markets. Now, I picked developing markets as my example because that's a definition that changes over time. Right, the list of market entries, members in the dimension, right, that are developing, right, some get promoted, if you will, right, they no longer consider developing, they're in the mainstream. markets and other new markets get added. So that set is going to need to change over time. Well, if I've shared that set, I can go into the report where I defined that set, update it to the new set of values, and then suddenly all of the reports that use that shared set are now going to run with the new definition of developing markets. So this gives me a way to centrally manage interesting sets. And then I can make them available to other report authors. Of course, they have to be able to access the report they're defined in, right? So if I added this report to the package and then I went to, and another user tried to use it and they didn't have access to the report with the set, it won't work. So there's a permissions thing here, right? It's something you got to manage, but ultimately it is a terrific enhancement. In Analysis Studio, I was able to reuse sets. That wasn't sharing, that was reusing, because it was a copy of the set, and then if I changed the set in one place, it didn't auto-update the others. This is a sharing. This is, if you will, a pointer to a set definition that I can use in multiple places. So it's far more powerful than the capability that was baked into Analysis Studio. So this is a big improvement. I think one that's going to help us, because we do a lot of that sort of stuff in a framework model for relational data in terms of centrally managing definitions, and now I have a way to centrally manage set definitions in OLAP world. In Report Studio, there are a couple of new active report properties that are available because I can only use Report Studio to create active reports. Under the File menu, there is an Active Reports property entry. When you launch that, you'll see there are two new checkboxes after you've upgraded. The first one is to compress the active reports. So I told you before that they had done a lot with compression. They've actually made it optional as to whether you want to compress or not your active report output. By default, it's going to compress. Those are checked. Both are default by on. You can turn them off if you want. So the first one is turn on or off compression. The second is turn on or off this thing called scalable. Now, scalable is not self-explanatory in my mind. What scalable is really is enabling or disabling the use of pinch to zoom gestures for the active report when viewed on an iPad. So if you want to enable pinch to zoom on your active report, you want this enabled, which it is by default, which is good. If you disable it so that they can't pinch the zoom, that's when you would disable it. So that's what scalable does. Now the visualizations, that third big theme. And I think if you're going to IOD, I think we're going to hear a lot more about visualizations and plans for the future. They're pretty good right now, though, I got to say. This screenshot is actually a screenshot of this active report. So here's an active report that was created using visualizations. Now, already you're seeing different chart types than were in the standard chart library. Right, here's a standard line chart that's nothing new or special, but it is done as an interactive visualization in this particular example. Here's a bubble chart that is different than the bubble charts that are in the chart engine. Here's a network chart. Here is a tree chart. I don't know why these are called tree charts, but I guess they are. I'm just going to show you a couple of things in here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. And again, we're going to have a webinar in November where we're going to deep dive into this world of visualization. So I'll click here. So here is an example of a bubble chart with multiple axes on an active report. And I'm just going to click around here. I'm going to choose to look at it for golf equipment. And you see, it's not only changing the chart, it's also animating the chart. So from a look and feel, from an attractiveness perspective, right? We want to make dashboards attractive because attractive dashboards get used more. It's just axiomatic. I know it sounds kind of silly or simple, but the fact is, if it's an interesting dashboard to use, people will use it more. So this animation thing, and that's turn on or off. If you're not into the animation, you don't have to have the animation. But these charts here, these are our new charts for your use. So you've got the chart engine from 8, you got the chart engine from 10, and now you have the visualization engine that is running on something called RAID, which is a standards-based engine. So we'll go more deeply into all of that stuff and how you enable this when you attend the webinar that's coming up where you listen to the playback. So this is using it in an active report, which with 10.2.1 was the only kind of report that supported the RAID engine. However, with 10.2.1.1, in other words, install 10.2.1 and then apply the fix pack, Visualizations are available on any Report Studio or Cognos Workspace Advanced report. So that's a major reason to apply the FixPack straight away if you haven't already gotten to 10.2.1. So do that as part of your upgrade. If you're already on 10.2.1, I think you're going to want to apply the FixPack anyway. But now you have visualizations across the board. So any report can use the chart engines from 8, the chart engine from 10, or the visualization engine. So this visualization engine is actually accessible in Report Studio or Cognos Workspace Advanced by dragging the visualization tool in from the toolbox. Drop it on a page, and you'll be presented with a wizard that gives you the list of visualizations that are available. Where do you get visualization? Actually, when you first install the release, there are none installed, which surprised me anyway. So I dragged the visualization tool on and found this wizard empty. These visualizations are actually downloadable from the IBM website analyticszone.com. So analytics with an S, zone.com. Analyticzone.com is not the same. So analyticszone.com. And you can download visualizations from there. So Cognos has a bunch of partners who are building these, right, using this Rave engine and the language that goes with it. For the technical people out there, it's a JSON-based language. You build these, you post them up to Analytics Zone, and people can download them and import them into Cognos using a screen in the admin part of Cognos. Then they're available here. You drag them onto your report. They've got drop zones like categories and series and default measure, just like you're used to with charts. So it's really rather straightforward to start leveraging these. There's a couple of tricks. There's a couple of properties that are worth noting and looking at, but net, it's like another chart. It's just a different tool than the chart tool. And you have to have imported visualizations from the Analytics Zone to get started. So very exciting, really moves the world of visualization forward in a big way in the BI space for IBM. In Cognos Workspace Advanced, I already told you the ones that you get that were in common with Report Studio. The only other enhancement to CWA is in the world of custom grouping, there's always been a button in the button bar to create custom groups. Now they've added a right-click action to get at the creation for custom groups, so it's simpler than using the button. That's the only other change that was in CWA in this release. In Cognos Workspace, there's a couple of changes to how you filters. When you add filters to your workspace, I'll show you some screenshots of that. Prior to 10.2.1, when I added a filter from my toolbox in Workspace, it went out, it read in the values at that time, and those values never got updated. So as I added new rows to my database, I didn't get those new rows in the filters on my workspaces, which was sort of vexing. And the only way to get those new rows was actually to delete the filter and re-add the filter to my workspace, which was not awesome. In this release, there's a way for you to refresh. Tell the filter, go out and always refresh. So it always gets the latest and greatest data when I open the workspace. So that's new and improved. Drilling continues to be improved. There was some issues with retaining formatting and nesting when I drilled up and down. Those have been fixed in this release. And there's always there's a chart recommender that's been part of the 10 world and the Cognos Workspace world now for a while. And the recommender has been improved, so it makes better recommendations. Hard to show better in a webinar, so I didn't try. But the recommender has been improved. Let's talk about 10.2.1 now with Workspace. In Workspace, I think it was 10.1.1 where they introduced this notion of multi-tab and a global area and multiple tabs in a workspace. And it turned out that you couldn't copy an item from tab 1 to tab 2, or from a tab to a global, or from global to a tab. And you couldn't duplicate a tab. The kinds of things that you would sort of expect you'd be able to do to be able to get a lot of reuse once you've defined your first set of objects in tab 1, those are all here now. So when you apply the FixPack, you'll find that you've got capabilities now in Workspace that allows you to duplicate tabs, copy objects from one tab to another, or from a tab to global and back. And the support for Rave visualizations now as widgets in a workspace is part of 10.2.1.1 because now the visualizations are more pervasive after applying the FixPack, and now that includes being pervasive and usable and as a workspace widget. Going back to the like items enhancements. So when I add a filter, whether it's a slider filter or a select value filter, from the toolbox in Workspace to my workspace, up through and including 10.2.0, it might be that you had 2 data items on 2 different widgets. One was like a year and maybe one was year that the order closed. And Cognos sees those as 2 separate data items, even though they both have the same values. They both have 2011, 2012, 2013. And in previous to 10.2.1 releases, I could not tell Cognos, hey, treat them as the same field, give me one filter on the workspace that would filter both fields. In this release, 10.2.1, I've got this checkbox now. And when I enable the checkbox, it will allow me to say these items, regardless of their name. In the case here, the names are similar, they don't have to be. These items all get filtered by one filter. So it's a terrific tool for when you've got lots of role-playing dimensions in your model. What do I mean by that? Well, you might have a time dimension that's for the order date, the ship date, the close date, the bill date. Well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to filter all those dates with one prompt instead of separate prompts? Sometimes it's nice to be able to combine them all into one prompt. Sometimes you want them separate. This lets me do either based on my needs. So that's what this enhancement does for me, which I think was a terrific enhancement. Moving on to mobile. I've already talked a little bit about the mobile enhancements. For example, where the reports are actually run, where the load is carried, so that we get better throughput and better auditing. In addition to those kinds of changes, the user interface has been changed. If you haven't downloaded the latest and greatest iPad app, you probably should. It is backwards compatible. My recollection is that it will work with 10.1.1 forward, the latest one. But check your release notes. Your mileage may vary, but that's my recollection. Is that it'll do 10.1.1 forward. Certainly, it will work with 10.2.0, 10.2.1, 10.1.1. And it is different. It's more iPad-y, if you'll let me say it that way. It looks more like a native iPad app and a little less like a stranger on the iPad. From a report rendering perspective, it was not really fully supportive of the latest HTML standards in previous releases. Now it truly embraces the HTML 2.0 standards, and so I get better rendering of my HTML output on this device. And also, they call it higher fidelity HTML outputs. That really will impact your prompt controls and some layout, report layouts. Some page layouts weren't respected on the iPad that were when you ran them on your browser on your regular PC. Some of those are now respected in the output. Not all, but some. The prompt controls are much better now in terms of how they're rendered. Zooming on active reports, provided you've kept that scalable option checked. The audit logging I talked about, and the prompting again being more touch-friendly is also part of this release. So good improvements. Primarily, this is look and feel and interaction improvements on the iPad app. The mobile browser-based, text-based UI has not been vastly improved. This is really about the native app on the iPad. All of the auditing stuff is part of that. I'm talking about the look and feel stuff is real iPad specific. We're getting close to the end here. Dynamic cubes. So lots of improvements in terms of dynamic cubes. Security for dimensions and attributes has been enhanced. You can do tables now for your database security. So in the relational world, right, we might have a table that says Rich Chester can see the Americas region, and that's all he can see. And I would join that in my framework model, and I would do data level security based on that table. That wasn't supported in dynamic cubes, that security model in previous releases. Now it is. From a relative time perspective, relative time in cubes is really very common, right? Month to date, year to date. This time of year, but last year, those kinds of relative time calculations have improved. Relative time capabilities in this release, I heard one person from IBM say that it was on par now with the relative time capabilities of PowerPoint, which means that it's vastly improved over the last release. There's an auto designer, right click, make me a cube. That's gotten better, so it makes better guesses, it builds better cubes, so you have less manual fixing to do after you've done the initial generation. You can import InfoSphere warehouse cube metadata, so you can basically rebuild a cube you built with warehouse cubing services in this tool now, sort of at a 1 or 2 click basis, as opposed to having to do it all manually again. You can actually leverage that metadata. Can't leverage framework model metadata yet, but this InfoSphere warehouse cubing services metadata has been added. And then there's a whole new administration screen that I'll give you a screenshot for in just a moment. That's part of this. In addition, with the fixed pack, they've now given you a programmatic interface so that you can automate the creation of your cube model programmatically with this API. This was something that people asked about originally when we first introduced dynamic cubes. One of the most common questions I got is there an API? And the answer was no. Now the answer is yes. There is an API. So just like with Transformer, I can automate the creation of my cube models. This will come in really, really handy as I embed security, which is often why we automate the creation of our cube models is for security. So that's part of the fixed pack. Scooching over to this new page I told you about. So up in the Cognos administration world, on the status tab, you now have this data stores entry on the status tab. And this is where now you can go from one-stop shopping to manage your dynamic cube. If you saw my previous webinar, we talked about dynamic cubes and deploying them. There were 3 or 4 places in the administration screens you had to go in order to do things like associate a user to the startup of the cube, add the cube to a dispatcher, start the cube, look at the messages from the cube, add security to the cube. All of those were in different places in administration. Cognos has now centralized all of those functions into a single place in the admin screen, which is great. So that's part of it. And you know, if we do another dynamic cube webinar, then we'll go into details on this screen then. But at least now you know it's available. From a multi-tenancy perspective, lots of new capabilities from a tenancy perspective. Again, there's a deep dive of multi-tenancy available on the YouTube channel as well as on our website that'll get you more into what this is. But for those of you who are using or think of using multi-tenant, there is a terrific set of improvements that are part of this release 10.2.1, including relatively easy onboarding new tenants, removing existing tenants, moving a tenant from one environment to another, utilization reporting of how a tenant is using the content store, locking out a tenant temporarily, let's say while you're updating their content, and creating a default user profile. And there's a whole screen now dedicated in the administration role that I'll show you a screenshot of in a minute for doing all of these things for your tenant management. In the 10.2.1.1 fixed pack, there's an additional capability called Tenant Impersonation. So as the administrator, right, it's sometimes nice to be able to get in and say, okay, everything that I create should now be should be owned by tenant number 2. So you can go in and you can say, I'm going to impersonate tenant number 2. Or in my example here, Spacely Sprockets, my tenant. And everything I create in this session now will automatically get associated to Spacely Sprockets tenant ID. In addition, I have a checkbox that says, and now show me the view of my public folders if I were logged in as a Spacely Sprocket user. So I have both options here from this impersonation. So that comes with the fixed pack. All the other stuff came with 10.2.1.0, if you will. And this is that tenant administration screen that I was talking about that allows you to see all the tenants that have been onboarded, allows you to manage their sessions, create profiles, export them, understand their content utilization, set some properties for them, including default tabs and that sort of stuff, and to temporarily disable and then re-enable access by those tenants to your environment. And that, my friends, is in a very quick way the end-to-end list of the enhancements and features that are part of 10.2.1. Now, if you've been on a webinar with me before, you realize that I always end up having more information that fits in an hour, and I'm also always ready to stay on for an extra 10 minutes and try to answer some of the questions that I'm sure you've been submitting as we go. So, Jesse, could you shoot me some questions, please?
All right. So, if anyone has any additional questions, please post them to the chat window or the Q&A window. So, Rich, we got a couple related to this. It's basically the same question. Some folks in the middle of upgrade to 10.2, based on what you, middle of upgrade to 10.2.1, based on what you've seen with this most recent fixed pack, you know, should they consider going right to 10.2.1.1 at this point?
Absolutely. I can say with zero hesitation that my recommendation would be that when you install 10.2.1, that you then install the fixed pack. Now, that it's a fixed pack. So this is not an uninstall 10.2.1 and install 10.2.1.1. That's not what this is. This is install 10.2.1 and then run the setup for 10.2.1.1, and it overlays it. So if you're already up and live on 10.2.1, it's not an uninstall, reinstall activity. This is not that. If you're installing 10.2.1, running the fix pack, if you engaged LPA to install 10.2.1 for you right now, you'd get the fix pack. We wouldn't even have a discussion about it for a brand new installation. If you're already up on 10.2.1, clearly you're going to want to do this in dev. You're going to want to do some testing, right? But if you're installing 10.2.1 and you're in the middle of an upgrade activity, I would not recommend do 10.2.1, all your testing, deploy, and then do 10.2.1.1 and all your testing again and a deployment again. That would not be my recommendation.
Okay, great.